So as we look at the book of Exodus today, I want to start with a question about the Israelite people, about kind of their history a little bit. What are some of the feasts of the Jews? Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is Passover. Tabernacles, good. There are celebrations or trumpets blown at the new moons, but that's a mark of a beginning of a month. So there are these annual feasts. What do you think of any other annual feast?
Jewish feast?
Yep.
Feast of Ingathering?
Yep, the Feast of Ingathering, which is a harvest one, is also Pentecost. So some of these come by a lot of different names. Feast of Booths, Feast of Tabernacles, that one is another one. And there's another one that's very, very important, a yearly feast. In fact, it's the only day that people are told to fast in the Jewish calendar. The Day of Atonement. So these are the major feasts that people are celebrating, and then there's more infrequent ones, things like the sabbatical year or the year of Jubilee. But when we think about the feasts of the Jews, we want to consider and think about how the yearly calendar operates, okay? Because the Feast of Passover is a very significant feast we're going to look at a little bit more today because of how it impacts the people of Israel. But when we think about the ministry of Jesus, when we think about Jesus and we talk about the gospel and we preach to people and share what Jesus had done for them, one of the primary things that we often share with people is about how Jesus died for their sins, right? I'm pretty sure any of us who have preached the gospel make that a major point of emphasis, that Jesus died for their sins. But that begs a question of us. If Jesus' primary purpose in coming, giving his life and resurrecting, was to pay for the sins of humanity, then why didn't Jesus die at the Day of Atonement? The day that pays for the entire sins of the nation of Israel. Why didn't Jesus just give his life at the Day of Atonement in September? And why did he die and resurrect at Passover? And we'll look at how those things parallel with one another and what Jesus was doing. Because I think when we understand the Old Testament story and what God was doing with his people, we will end up preaching a more holistic gospel than just Jesus died for your sins and just kind of leave it there. Right? Because the Passover festival was much more than that. And Jesus' death was much more than just for your sins as a sacrifice. Right? There's a lot more implications to it than that. And we'll see that through the Passover feast today. And we'll draw some of those parallels between the Passover festival and Christ's death and resurrection as well, and how our salvation fits into what Jesus was doing then. So yesterday we left off with the eighth plague, the plague of the locust, and the ninth plague that comes is that of darkness, or the ninth sign. Okay. Now, this one probably would hit closest to home of any one of them so far as mindset worldview goes. Okay, so all of the other signs have hit close to home in providing for themselves or the nuisances or food and all that kind of stuff. But this one really hits close to the worldview because the sun is darkened in the sky for 3 days. Okay. And it is such an intense darkness for the people that they're groping around, right, because of it. So in the story, in chapter 10, it says that this is a darkness to be felt, right? And what some people propose is that this probably is a very, very dense sandstorm that blows into Egypt. And when it is so dense that people cannot even open their eyes to see. So the darkness is imposed by the severity of the sandstorm, and that people are not even able to open their eyes, and the darkness upon the land. That sandstorms can get so dense that it seems as though it is dusk all day long, because the sun seems to be blotted out of the sky. Okay? And so for Pharaoh, who is an embodiment and representation of Ra, and as you guys heard yesterday at the museum, claims to represent the variety of gods, throughout various places in Egypt. This would be a huge confrontation against Pharaoh, who now is being blotted out of the sky and shown that he has no power. And so it kind of culminates at this point. Okay, so you have all of the first signs from the snake all the way to the locust, and now this darkness, and it is this major confrontation against Pharaoh himself, right? And so when you started in chapter 5, it was, who is the Lord, right? And now the biggest confrontation will be against the person who made that question, or who's asked that question. And then the 10th plague will be against all of them. Okay, so the 9th plague is against Pharaoh specifically, and then you've got the 10th plague. So when we consider the 10th plague here, this death of the firstborn son, one of the main targets in all of this, of course, is Pharaoh as the protector of his people. Okay, because Pharaoh kind of presents himself in that respect, but against all of the gods of Egypt as well. As it says in chapter 12, verse 12, that this is a judgment upon all of the gods of Egypt. Now, why is it a judgment against all of the gods of Egypt? Because what it shows is that none of them have the power to preserve or protect human life. That human life is in the hands of Yahweh, right, the creator of heaven and earth. Okay? And nothing can protect them. So that's the major judgment against Pharaoh and against the gods themselves, is they have the complete inability to protect people. What is unique about this moment is that it is the first time that Israel has to be active in their response. Prior to this, Israel had been passive in all of the other plagues or signs. That they just sat back and let God take care of things, and they just kind of let it happen. But now they actually have to make some kind of response in their protection and in their participation in this. So this requires a step of faith-filled obedience. Because they have no idea if the slaughter of a lamb and the touching of the posts and the lintel of their door with blood is actually going to do anything. Right? It's just a symbol. It is not anything that is going to be incredibly profound and somehow super spiritual in the action of doing it. They have to take an animal, slit its throat, collect the blood, take a brushy plant, a hyssop branch, and touch parts of their door with it. Okay, so this is a ritual. Okay, and that word can kind of have maybe a little bit of religious overtone to it in some of our minds, that ritual practices are somehow less godly, or because they're not spontaneous, that they are somehow less spiritual. But that's something that we have got to dismantle in our Western worldview, and specifically our Protestant worldview, is that somehow ritual practices inside of the church are less spiritual because they are written down or because they are repetitively practiced. Okay? One of the important things for us to learn is that rituals really embody a community's understanding of who they are and who their God is. And pretty much all of the Pentateuch is ritualistic literature. Right? The book of Leviticus, the book of Numbers, the book of Deuteronomy are full of rituals that Israel is supposed to practice. For example, the Passover Feast is a ritual. It's something they did every single year. They did the exact same thing. And that is meant to solidify and make firm in their minds their understanding of who God is and what He has done for them, and how they should understand Him in the future. Okay, so anthropologists will say that ritual will reveal a community's understanding of themselves at the deepest level, and the understanding of who they worship at the deepest level. So when we look at the ritualistic literature in here, we want to look at what are they trying to convey through the bigger picture of it. Okay? So not just the individual actions of it, but the whole scenario. And what we see with Israel is they have got to put their faith in God, to trust Him, because nothing has happened yet, and yet they're called to make this action that will protect them. And that something must die for their protection. Okay? Which will end up being just what we see later on. And so we'll look at the Passover feast, and then I'll come back to this, probably the bigger question at hand is the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. Okay, so the Passover feast really becomes the central festival for Israel. So significant that it reorients their entire calendar year. Okay, so now the first of the year is Passover. Now, when you think of New Year's in January, New Year's is all about new things, right? Even if you don't really believe in the power of resolutions, people still make new steps on January 1st. It's a start of something brand new. It's the start of a new season. It's the start of a new year. A lot of us ask God, what do you have this year on December 31st or within the first few days in January? So even for us, it's a major transition time every single year is the season change at January 1st. And so for the Israelites to have a brand new year at the same time as their freedom from the Egyptians and their release to become a brand new people, that would speak a ton about their future, about their expectations of what God will do, is that every single year they celebrate at the new year God's release of them from slavery. So this creates in them an expectation of God's plan for the future and how he will set them up and how he will free them from other oppressors. And so that's why you get to the time of Jesus and the people are so expectant of God to free them, right? Every single year they celebrate. At the beginning of the year, God's freedom for them from a physical oppressor. And that's why they were so expectant of Jesus to be that deliverer. So they reorient their whole year around this. And then that event becomes consistent throughout the Old Testament. So as this festival institutes as the Passover institutes this festival of unleavened bread and bringing this idea of freedom from slavery, we see some connecting points. So I'm on slide 54 here. And so with the law and the Old Testament purposes behind these things, we see a variety of connecting points that give implications or understanding of the ritual. All right, so with the first, we see that they're supposed to keep the lamb from the 10th to the 14th days. And that comes from Exodus 12, 3 and 6. And this is to form a bond with the sacrifice. So there's some kind of relationship of this animal brought into the home and of this bonding together. The animal is to be without blemish. There's to be nothing wrong with it, no ear missing, no scars, no damage to the animal, which embodies then the holiness of the Lord for the people, the completeness of the sacrifice. There's to be no broken bones, and again, embodying this idea of a whole sacrifice. Nothing has been tarnished with what they are giving unto God, which goes back to an important lesson in Genesis chapter 4 with Cain and Abel. That when we see Cain and Abel offering their sacrifices, we see that God is accepting of Abel's sacrifice, but not of Cain's sacrifice. And there is nothing wrong necessarily with offering God food, like Cain offers to him. That would be an acceptable offering to God. But the qualifier is that Abel offers to God the best of his flock, where Cain's offering has no qualifier with it. There's nothing special about it. It's just food. It's not the first, it's not the best, it's not the biggest, but Abel offers the best. And so what we see with the sacrifices to God and what will be presented in Leviticus and Numbers is that God is always deserving of the best, the first and foremost. He's not the one that we give our scraps to and our leftovers, that after we've gotten our paycheck and paid all of our bills, then we give God 10% of whatever's left over, right? That we would give unto God generously first. Right? And that's the model that we see beginning to be portrayed here, is you don't just give him that one sheep that you don't want. It was born a year ago. It has 3 legs. So what? The blood's still the same, right? No. It's got to cost them something. It's got to be worth something to the people. And they're supposed to eat bitter herbs on the day, which seems to remind them of the bitterness of slavery, but also the bitterness of sin and death later on, as this festival is connected with a deeper spiritual meaning. The unleavened bread that they're told to eat at the feast is in remembrance of the haste with which they left Egypt. And when we think about leaven in the ancient world, there's a variety of different implications of it. With Jesus, he talks about leaven as teaching. And so he says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. So beware of their teaching. Leaven at other times is connected with sin. And so to remove the leaven from the dough, or that leaven permeates dough and gets throughout the entirety of the lump, no matter how small. And we're not talking about instant dried yeast if you're a baker. This is like sourdough leaven. Okay, so it's just like just water and dough that has had time to turn into a leavening agent. Okay, so that they're supposed to eat the bread unleavened, reminding them of the haste. And then the blood on the doorposts sets them apart distinctly. Now, this was not just to say that ethnic Israelites could put the blood over their doorposts and be protected. This was an instruction for anybody who would participate, that they would be protected by their step and by their action of putting blood on the doorposts. Now, the picture that I had before this, on the slide, maybe two before this, was that of that looked like a cross. As they dip the blood on the sides, they dip the blood into the brush into the pan, and touch all the portions of the door, that it could kind of drip across or drag across like a cross on the door. Now, that's just a assumption or suggestion. No one really knows how it was done, but we do know that they put it across the lintel on the top and the posts on the side. Okay. And then it is only for those who've been circumcised. Okay, so this seems to be something that is imposed upon the community in the law because of those who came out with Israel. So in chapter 12, it says that there was a mixed group of people who came out with Israel in response to all of these signs. And so potentially this is their inclusion into the covenant. Now, one of the important things to know is that God never made distinctions where certain people could not come into the covenant. Okay? Anybody who wanted to join the covenant community could join the covenant community. There are commands in the book of Deuteronomy where it says that a Moabite to about the 5th generation cannot come into the covenant community of God. Right? But what you see is that people like Ruth, who is a Moabite, come into the covenant people of God. David, who is descendant from Ruth, and he's only a 3rd generation from Ruth, will be the one who gathers all the resources to build the temple. Solomon, who is within that, he's a 4th generation Moabite, is the one who builds the temple and dedicates it. So what we see is that God seemingly will always make exceptions for the right heart. Okay? That no matter what he says, that if a person wants to come into the community of God, and wants to be joined in with his people, the exceptions are always made for the heart of the individual who shows it sincerely desiring to be a part of his people. And there are plenty of Gentiles who come into God's people throughout the Old Testament. That God heals, that he meets, that he reveals himself to. And so you guys will see that all throughout the scriptures. Probably one of the most important Gentiles that God reveals himself to is Abraham. Right? Abraham, it says that his faith was counted to him as righteousness before he was circumcised. So before he bore the covenant mark on his body, he was counted righteous before God. Okay? So he is one of the supreme models, and one of the ways that Paul uses as this picture of God receiving Gentiles is Abraham being counted righteous before that time. So this feast really gives the people this identity that they may not have had before as a new people. It starts of a new year, God freeing his people from slavery, setting them apart as those who he is going to plant in the land, give the law, and set up as representatives for the world. All right, so let's talk about this question here about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. Okay. Because this is quite an important one that people ask about oftentimes, and I think is worth a little bit of time of discussing. Because it doesn't just come up here, it will also come up in the New Testament. In the book of Romans chapter 9, Paul will also mention the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. So this is a subject matter that is across the Bible. And we will see that at various times, people do demonstrate hardened hearts. In fact, Jesus asked his disciples, "Why have you hardened your hearts?" in Mark chapter 8. So there are other moments where people have hardened their own hearts and have made themselves kind of stubborn in receiving the words of God. So why? Why does this happen to Pharaoh? And what does it teach us? Well, first thing to recognize is that this is written reflectively. Okay? This is not written as a journal entry. I think I might have mentioned that before. It's not like Moses went home after the 5th plague and was like, okay, Pharaoh hardened his heart today. And then the 6th plague, oh, it was God. God hardened Pharaoh's heart today. You know, this is written much later, probably, at least a year later, if not 40 years later, as Moses reflects upon the events and is writing in light of this. And what we get with the Hebrew literature is that the author is always a third-person narrator who seems to be an omniscient individual, right? He's almost writing as though he was God, knowing all the heart and intention of the individuals in the story. And so, oftentimes, writing into the text what they had done, what they had thought, what they were intending to do to other people. So all of that in mind, or we've got to keep all of that in mind as we consider this story. Because when we see with Pharaoh here, the initial question that prompts all of this is chapter 5, verse 2. And I know I keep coming back to that passage, but I think that that is the precedent for chapters 7 through 10, or 12 really, is who is the Lord? Okay? And so Pharaoh's hardening of his heart, his own personal response, I think really is prompted from that place. Okay, so there are 11 times where it talks about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart between chapters 7 and chapter 10. Okay, so I'm going to list each one of them here for us, or the main ones at least from each one. Okay, so the sign of the snake. It says that Pharaoh's heart was hardened in chapter 7, verse 13. In the first sign, the Nile turning to blood, in 7:22, it says that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. In the second sign, in 8:15, it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart. In the third sign, 8:19, it says that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. In this fourth sign, 8:32, it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart. In 9:7, it says that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. In the sixth sign, chapter 9, verse 12, it says, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. Then in the seventh sign, the hail, in 9:35, it says that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And then in the last three, 8, 9, and 10, it says the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. Okay, chapter 10, verse 20, chapter 10, verse 27, chapter 11, verse 10. Okay. So there are three kind of different ways of talking about Pharaoh's hardened heart. It either says that Pharaoh hardened his heart, that his heart was hardened, or the Lord hardened his heart. So what does that immediately teach us about this event? Some thoughts. What are your thoughts? What does this teach us about this event, or this response? That it was his response as well. Right? That's what you're saying? Yeah. So I think that's the first thing we should notice, right? Is that it is not just God doing something to Pharaoh, but it is his response as well. And until the sixth sign, you don't even get the name of the Lord mentioned in accordance with the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. So for the first 6 times that it happens, it's seemingly all on Pharaoh. Before this time where God says he's going to harden his heart? Before the sign, right? Yeah, so God speaks ahead of time about what will happen with the scenario. But what we see is the response to these events. Because in chapter 4, God will also say that he'll harden Pharaoh's heart. So we do see this preemptive statement from God in chapter 4 at the beginning of chapter 7, before any signs have been done to Pharaoh, that God is going to have his hand in the scenario. But what we see with the scenario as well is that Pharaoh is also participating in the situation. So with that in mind then, and with that key observation that Pharaoh is also participating in this situation, we can tie this in a little bit with some New Testament understanding of what is going on, and then looking at some other stuff in the Old Testament as well. Because, for example, in Romans chapter 1, in verses 21 through 24, and in 26 and 28, Paul basically lays out this understanding that God has given man the opportunity to come to him, but he's not holding them back from doing what they want. And it says that God gave them over to their sin. And what we want God to be the nice guy, to never let anything bad happen to people. But we also want God to be the nice guy who lets people do whatever they want. And we can't have it both ways. Right? You don't get to be the nice guy who doesn't hurt people or doesn't let people get hurt. And you can't be the nice guy who controls people all the time. Right? He lets people do what they want to do, and he lets them do that. He gives them over to that. And that's what Paul talks about in Romans, is man has continually sought their own selfish flesh, and God has said, hey, if you want to do that, you go ahead and do that. And that's kind of what we see, is that God is revealing himself. He's made himself known to people. And that's Paul's argument in Romans chapter 1. He's made himself known. And Exodus chapter 9, verses 14 through 16 gives us that idea that God wanted to be known, and so he's revealing himself. And then it's up to man to choose to come to him. Okay. We got this at the beginning of chapter 7, before the signs ever start. Chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. That Pharaoh had the opportunity to come to God, had the opportunity to repent, had the opportunity to give up the people of Israel, but he chooses not to. Because of this statement, who is the Lord, at the beginning. Now, when we see man's hardening of heart, the means by which God hardens people's hearts is not always a supernatural intervention, or it may not even necessarily be a supernatural intervention. Sometimes man's heart can be hardened just through the ordinary experiences of life that operate through the principles and character of human nature around them, which could be then seen as being appointed by God. And so the Hebrew view of the events of things like this, what we've talked about, is that they are happening by the institution of God, regardless of whether they are seeming to be happen naturally or supernaturally. That God has been the one who is orchestrating all things. Okay. So I want to read this passage in chapter 9 of Romans that kind of mentions the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, because it also brings up an important illustration that comes from the prophets, which we'll look at then as well, as a larger scope to the scriptures. So in Romans chapter 9, verse 14, it says, "What shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part? By no means, for he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So then it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy. For the scriptures say to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I've raised you up, that I might show my power to you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills. You will say to me then," which is the natural response, right? Every one of us has this question then. Why does God still find fault? Right? If he hardens whom he wills and he has mercy on whom he wills, why does God still find fault in anybody? Shouldn't he just then say, you're going to go to heaven, you're going to go to hell, and leave it at that? And Paul will go on to say, "But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to mold out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use? What if God, desiring to show his wrath, to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath, prepared for destruction, in order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy, which he's prepared beforehand for glory? Even us, whom he has called, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. So Paul begins to bring in a very, very popular illustration. And this is the potter and the clay, which we've heard so, I'm sure we have heard so often, right? God is the potter, we're the clay, and we're being shaped and molded by him, right? And he has control over the situation, and we're the ones who are simply being shaped by him. Yeah. Romans 9. It's worth it to read the whole passage, but I was specifically reading, from 9:14 through 24. Yeah. So we get this potter and the clay illustration then that Paul is using here, and that comes from the prophets. And so Isaiah talks about God being the potter and his people being the clay. Jeremiah talks about it as well. And so I'm going to read the one from Jeremiah, because the Isaiah one is quite brief. It's usually just one stitch in a parallelism, so it's just usually one line. It doesn't give us a lot of detail. But the picture that Jeremiah sees here gives us a bigger understanding of God's relationship in this scenario, and then man's role as well. Okay, so Jeremiah chapter 18 is where I'm going to be at. And I'm going to read from Jeremiah 18 here. Starting in verse 1, we're going to go all the way down to verse 11. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord: Arise, and go down to the potter's house, and there I will let you hear my words. So I went down to the potter's house, and there he was working at a vessel, and the vessel he was making of clay was spoiled in the potter's hands. And so he reworked it into another vessel, as it seemed good to the potter to do. Okay. Now that's kind of what you would expect, right? A potter to just rework a vessel however he would want, and which in whichever capacity he seems to deem it viable for. And then in verse 5 it says, Then the word of the Lord came to me. O house of Israel, can I not do with you as this potter has done, declares the Lord? Behold, like the clay in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel. If at any time I declare concerning a nation or a kingdom that I will pluck up and break down and destroy it, and if that nation concerning which I have spoken turns from its evil, I will relent of the disaster that I intended to do to it. And if at any time I declare concerning a nation or a kingdom that I will build and plant it, and if it does evil in my sight, not listening to my voice, then I will relent of the good I have intended to do to it. Now, therefore, say to the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, Thus says the Lord, Behold, I'm sharpening disaster against you and devising a plan against you. Return, every one of you, from his evil way and amend your ways and your deeds. So, is it the potter or the clay? Yes. And this is one of the examples of an incredibly obvious biblical tension. And one of the things that we as Bible students must come to the acceptance of is that the Bible is full of tensions. It is not that you will not come to compartmentalized answers that we prefer in our Western linear thinking. The Bible is written in this way that God is not fully knowable. And at any point that we can define God and make God fully knowable, he has become an idol to us and is not God. At any point that we can fully define God, he is no longer God to us, but he is an idol. Because we are the created and he is the creator. He has made himself known, but we cannot fully know him. And because of that, there are tensions in our understanding of who he is. There are things that will be irresolvable to a rational mind that can just be simply accepted because we are the created and he is the creator. One of these is predestination and free will. The idea that we have the choice to come to God, and yet he has also predestined history. And people will have all sorts of good thoughts and seemingly logical conclusions of how we can reconcile these two, but no one of those arguments fully reconciles the conversation. And this is another example of it. It seems that the potter is the one shaping the clay, but at the same time, the clay is also the one that decides to run in the potter's hands. Will they be soft or will they be hard? Will they allow the potter to shape them? Will they repent? Or will they harden themselves against the Lord and bring destruction upon themselves? And this is a tension inside of the Bible that really is irresolvable, but is acceptable because God is so much bigger than we are. And one of the careful things that we must walk inside of is in our definition of God. In fact, past church fathers, as we've called them in the early church, the early centuries of the church, will say that God cannot be fully described in positives. This is who he is. But that our fullest understanding of God comes in the description of him in negatives. This is who he is not. And by understanding who he is not, we come to understand who he fully is. And so this idea then of understanding and being able to define and determine and box God in is a Western construction that we must avoid when we come to God. Is not to box him in, not to define him in such a way where he cannot do something that doesn't fit our box of who he is. So, with the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, it seems that there is a response possible on both sides, from Pharaoh and from God. And we do see both of them at work in this story to have a hard heart. Could his heart have been softened? Scriptures seem to point us in the direction that yes, it could have been. But in the spectrum of God, seeing the whole situation, seeing the outcome of Pharaoh, seeing the outcome of the freedom from slavery, that God participates in Pharaoh's choice to harden his heart. And he says, if that is what you want to do, then I will give you over to that. I'll let you have that. Which is kind of what links with then Romans chapter 1 as we highlighted before. Yes?
So how would the whole, God being described in positives versus negatives, how would that fit into, Pharaoh's heart being hardened? So, what would be the he is not statement for Pharaoh's heart?
I'll have to get back to you
Okay.
on it. But the idea is that that God is sees the full situation that we do not see in its simplest terms. All right. So that may not bring resolution to anybody's heart. I don't expect it to be honest. Because God is much bigger than resolving the things that we're concerned with about him. Yeah.
What was that you had said that quote,
yeah. It's a way of that is used in the East, like amongst Eastern Christians, in a way of describing God while maintaining the mystery of who he is. Yeah. So knowing the nature and character of God, but maintaining the mystery of God, that he as well dwells in thick darkness. So Israel begins to go out of Egypt. And as they begin to go out of Egypt, we see them plundering the Egyptians in chapter 12. And I think of it more than just like stealing all the Egyptians' property. It's like, get out of here, we're paying you to leave type of thing, right? God had said, ask the Egyptians and they will give you their wealth as you leave. And so we see that happening as they're plundering the Egyptians, which will come into play later on very significantly in two moments throughout the second half of the book of Exodus. But in chapter 12, verse 38 is quite an important note where we'll see that a mixed multitude also went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. And that mixed multitude testifies to chapter 7 or chapter 9, right? That God is revealing himself to the world. And the fact that there are people coming to God and going out with Israel testifies to the understanding of who God is for them to follow him. But the big question that comes in the previous verse is how many people actually came out of Egypt? Because what we have here is a account of 600,000 men. Whoa. I love the wind. It's so great. So the verse says in verse 37, and the people of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Sukkoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Okay. So this is an important discussion because it comes up again in Numbers and concerns then the historical Israel in their travels throughout the wilderness and then their occupation of the Promised Land in just a few decades. Okay. So 600,000 men is not including women and children, and if you estimate the women and children on top of that, you're looking at estimates as high as 2 to 3 million people. Women always have outnumbered men on the planet, and less so today than in history, but the average is about 51% women on the planet and 49% men. And in the ancient world, it was much higher because of warfare. Okay, so more men died in warfare than women, and so the estimates are much higher. So you have 600,000 men, but you've probably got a lot more women, as well as the fact that Hebrew babies had been killed for at least a handful of years during the end of the reign of the Pharaoh or the beginning of the second one. Okay, so you're looking at a lower rate. So then women and children would be somewhere between 2 to 3 million people. Okay. Now that is a very large number of people. And estimates of those people walking in some kind of lined formation that we see in the book of Numbers after the census would have stretched roughly from the Sinai Peninsula up to southern Israel and halfway back. Okay. So that's a lot of people, and it's hard to get lost with that many people in the desert. So what is going on here? On top of the geographical placement of the people, Moses having to communicate to the entire congregation of Israel without any kind of amplification devices would have been incredibly tough. You think as well upon the fact that 2 to 3 million people gathering enough manna to have for one day each day and then 2 days on Friday night or Friday morning would have been an incredible amount of space for manna to be falling upon, for livestock to be occupying land with them, and then as well for things simply like using the bathroom, okay? Because they had to use the bathroom outside of the camp. If you're a Levite who live in the center of the camp when the camp is placed and camped, then you would have to walk an average of an hour to get outside of the camp just to go and use the bathroom. So there are a number of logistical problems with the number of 600,000 men, not counting women and children. But you look at other things like the dwelling place issue, where in the book of Deuteronomy or the end of Numbers, it says that they dwelled on the plains of Moab between two cities that are roughly about, I think it's 5 to 7 miles apart. Okay, so these two cities 5 to 7 miles apart with 2 to 3 million people dwelling there is a 4 times higher population density than New York City today. Okay. So this is thousands of people living in 1 square mile area, and they cannot build vertically. Okay, they are in tents. They're only out horizontally. So the population density of that region, that space would be 4 times higher than the island of Manhattan today. Okay. that presents some challenges. Okay. Now, what we are not saying about those challenges is that it is impossible for God to meet the needs of the people. Okay. It's not impossible for God to provide manna for that many people. It's not impossible that Moses could project his voice through the power of the Spirit of God to that many people. But looking at the regular logistical things like going to the bathroom and the population density of the nation would have been an incredible feat for them to have accomplished. Okay. On top of that, it is pretty well documented, and as we know, that the nation of Canaan was not invaded by 3 million people. Okay, so the land of Canaan, the area that the nomadic people groups came into in the 13th or in the 14th century, was not at the degree of 3 million people. The other points to be aware of is that the Egyptian army, at the height of the Egyptian nation and in their history, the size of their army was about 20,000 soldiers. So 20,000 soldiers facing 600,000 slaves on foot would have been decimated by the Israelites. Slave revolts in the past had no trouble putting down soldiers who were fully armed with swords and chariots and cavalry when they outnumbered them to such a high degree. And that's evidenced by the Romans. But the fact that these people are so scared of the Egyptians, and also that when they go into the land of Canaan, which the estimates of the entire population of Canaan, men and women at this time, was anywhere between 60 and 100,000 people, gives it quite a confusing thought over why these people are scared. But let's look at Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 7. So chapter 7 verse 1 says, "When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hittites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mightier than you." Okay. And then verse 17 and 18 says, "If you say in your heart, these nations are greater than I, how can I dispossess them? You shall not be afraid of them, but you shall remember what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and to all Egypt." Okay. Now, in verse 6, we see an important note from God about the people, where he says, "For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the people on the face of the earth. It was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you, for you were the fewest of all people." Okay. Which is quite interesting when you consider the size of the number of the people of Israel. And what it seems like is that God is kind of saying, I like an underdog story. I want to choose the fewest people to do the greatest things through. And God does this at many times throughout Israel's history and in the New Testament as well. The people who seem to be the most unlikely people are often those who leave the greatest impact. For example, have you guys heard of the description of what Paul looked like? Has anybody heard that before? Paul was a short man who was balding on top, his eyebrows connected over his nose, and he was bow-legged because of all of the beatings that he had received. Hunched over because the muscles in his back had hardened from all the beatings. And that is what Paul looked like, roughly estimated about 5'2". From early church records of his what he looked like. Okay, not the guy you think of, right? You're like blonde hair, blue-eyed, 6'4", powerful preacher of the gospel, ripped, making tents all day, right? That's Paul the Apostle. God loves to work through people who don't make sense to us. Okay? And so with Israel, we see the same presentation. I didn't choose you because you're mighty. I didn't choose you because you're greater than anybody else. In fact, the reason I chose you is because you're nobodies. I chose you because you're the fewest of all peoples. Does that build up your faith in yourself? Like, great, I suck, you know. Right. So what's going on with the people then? Well, there's a couple of thoughts. One of the thoughts is that there's a challenge in the way to interpret or to translate the word Eleph in this passage, which means thousands, but can also be translated to mean military unit or soldier or clan. And so there's been various ways of reinterpretation of this phrase or this word to reduce the size of the number of the people of Israel anywhere to about 18,000 fighting men to 72,000 fighting men. Okay, so there are a variety of ways that this has been basically made a little more realistic. But that does present some challenges because of the way it's presented and how it's talked about in the book of Numbers. So what other people have proposed is that this could be an interaction with other ancient Near Eastern perspectives. Okay, so we've seen this already in talking about the flood and talking about creation and how these stories are giving apologetic to the ancient Near East and interactions to show who God is. And one of the ancient ways of communicating numbers was to basically hyperbolize the numbers for the sake of glory to their God. Okay? And so one of the thoughts is that maybe Israel is or maybe Moses is hyperbolizing the numbers to give this kind of consideration to the glory of God. We've seen a lot of the ancient Near Eastern interactions already. For example, Midas brought up one continually of the feet with the sandals, right? And how everybody's feet had no sandals in the statues that were made of them. And Moses being told to take off the sandals on his feet. So this familiarity with ancient Near Eastern culture is very much present. And so we see this being done by the Akkadians, by the Sumerians, by the Egyptians, by the Syrians. And so potentially Moses might be doing something similar here. And we would say, well, that seems to be a falsification or a deception. But that's only because you're reading it from your 21st century perspective back onto the text with your expectations of how a historical document should communicate things. Understanding it from his perspective is to look at this as a way, potentially, one of my suggestions would be to glorify God, to honor him. And so, just as a proposition there, I do think the numbers make a lot more sense in lower respects. And I personally prefer the translating idea of the translation in reducing the number of the people of Israel, even down to as many as 6,000 fighting men, which makes a lot more sense with their being scared, with their camping, with the size of the nation, how large the tents were, and the space in which they camped. When you get to St. Catherine's Cathedral and you see Mount Sinai, there's not a lot of space to camp there. In fact, it's pretty small. And so to think about 3 million people camping at the base of Mount Sinai really does not fit geographically if there's no way to build vertically. So just some reflections there, some thoughts. All right, any questions before we go to break? Yeah.
Is there any other evidence or anything out there that would help us to estimate the size?
Yeah, the three ways are the ways that I've kind of proposed, right? It's either literal, or it is we have to retranslate the word or redefine the word for fighting men to be more like units. So if you say like 600 fighting units, then you're looking more at a population, roughly about, fighting units 10 men, so 6,000 men. Or you're looking at it as a hyperbolized number, which fits the writing style of the ancient Near East. And I think that is a very viable option simply because it's cultural. Fits its culture.
Are there estimates of the population of Egypt, roughly, or?
I think we could. I haven't looked it up, but based off of the Canaanite estimation, which would be anywhere from 60 to 100,000, so probably somewhere in the 200 to 300,000 range in Egypt, just given the size of the land and where people were living at up and down the Nile River. Yeah. Any other questions?
So, like, given that, is there, like, other places in the Bible, too, that maybe we think is, like, literal, but when you try to make sense, you look into it? Or, like, is all that stuff kind of, like, looked into and, like, oh, like, yes, this does make sense, exactly. Or, like, other big things like that?
The only area that we see those large areas where there could be question is having to do with numbers.
So, like, it doesn't really.
Yeah, it's not a big deal. In other areas about like locations, so let's say for example like where something took place, those are really easily verifiable. The kings that were in power, very easily verifiable, and you can see corroboration from other ancient Near Eastern peoples. And then the numbers are where we get a little bit iffy, and a lot of people will recognize that the Hebrew people are not necessarily mathematicians. So we talked about this with years. All of the years are pretty much rounded to the nearest 10. Okay, so whether like you live for 120 years or 110 years or 430 years in Egypt or 480 years since the Exodus, or Jephthah will say that Israel has been in the land 300 years since the conquest, they tend to round years to the nearest 10, or at least to a 10. And so to say it's always exactly that period of time or this many people or numbers, we're dealing a little bit with some flexibility in that. Whereas the Sumerians, the people who are the history's greatest mathematicians, their numbers are incredibly precise, and you're always going to see a variety of ending numbers. So one of these examples would be that in the census in the book of Numbers, none of the census numbers end in 1, 7, 9, or I think it's 3. There's 4 numbers, but it's 1, 7, 9. None of the census numbers end in those numbers. And what you get is a plethora of census numbers throughout the book of Numbers, and so that's one of the questions that arises from that. All right, let's take 15 minutes. So. We'll come back and start again at 11:35. That's okay.
There's nuts here, so come around.
All right, so coming to the end of chapter 12 then, having looked at those numbers a little bit, there is something I want to point out to us in chapter 12, verse 50. Would someone read chapter 12, verse 50 for us? Nice and loud.
12:50.
Yep, 1250.
All the people of Israel did just as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. On that very day, the Lord brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their might.
Amen. Okay. What should stand out to us from the passage? Moses, Aaron, and all of the people did just as the Lord commanded. Okay? This is very significant because this does not happen very often. I mean, you're only in the second book of the Old Testament, but this doesn't happen very often. Israel is not going to be known for being the people who are the most obedient to God. And so having these moments where Israel is obedient to the Lord is quite special. Okay? Now, you remember what I said about repetition, either yesterday or on Monday? That it's incredibly important for the Old Testament, so when you see things repeated, you should make note of it. Okay? This phrase, that they did all the Lord commanded of them, or that they obeyed the Lord in some way, is repeated 25 times in this book. 25 times it's repeated that they did what the Lord commanded them. That should stand out to us, should be something that we observe and make note of as we look at this book. And think about how might this influence the readers of this book. As they're going into the promised land, as they saw the faithfulness of God to meet them and show up, and for the people's response to be of obedience, to walk in what God had asked of them, to be faithful followers of Him. And how would that then influence the Lord, and how should it influence us as well? Right? Is that something that characterizes our lives? Is obedience to the Lord? Because it is something that God does expect of us. That idea of obedience being repeated in the book of Exodus is significant as the real starting point for Israel as they're getting going in this journey of walking with Yahweh and following His covenant. But it's not something that ended with Christ's death and resurrection. That God's expectation of His people is still to walk in obedience, still to follow His ways. In fact, the way Jesus puts it in John 14, verse 15, is that if you love me, you keep my commandments. That's what Jesus says. Jesus' love language is obedience. For some of us, words of affirmation, or quality time, or gift giving. God's love language is obedience. And so the idea of God loving His people and of us loving God is done through actions, more than feelings. For example, John 3:16, for God so loved the world, and that word "so" is also translated in other places, for God loved the world in this way, that He sent His only Son. It's not about volume, it's about demonstration. It's not about so loving the world, right? But this is how He loved the world. He sent His Son. That's what God's love looks like. And so, we see how we love God is through our obedience to Him. And that's what the whole law is about. It's about love. We'll see that later on. But that idea, right? Rarely do I hear people talking about, I love God so much, I'm so obedient to Him. Usually it's, I love God so much, there's all these warm feelings and warm fuzzies for God. But it's rarely do people equate their degree of love to their extensive obedience. For example, another example of this is that the idea of abiding. How do we abide in God? He says, abide in me and I'll abide in you. How do you abide? Well, it's not through prayer. It's not through worship. It's not through soaking. It's not through any of those things, right? Jesus actually tells you how to abide in His presence in John 15:10. And this is, I was having this conversation with people on the first night, I think Monday night, Joseph, just this idea, because these things just sit on my mind so much, and looking at Exodus is just one way of these things being prompted, but the way we abide in God, the way we abide in Jesus, the way that He said it, right? Because we want to do things the way He said to do them, right? Making disciples through teaching people to obey the commandments of God. We want to love Him the way He wants to be loved. And so when He tells us to abide in Him, it would be probably pretty smart to not just conceptualize how we think we should abide in Him, rather to look at the Scriptures and say, how does He say we should abide in Him? I was in a small group recently where someone was saying, like, I just need to abide in God's presence. Need to just spend more time with Him. And that's not what He says. Jesus says, you abide in me by doing what I've asked you to do. John 15:10 says that, as I have done what my Father asked and have abided in Him, so you also will abide in me if you do what I command you. And I think like the capstone to all of this in John 15 is about friendship. And a lot of us may talk about ourselves as though we are friends of God just because we want to be his friend. But God's friendship is not determined by your desire for friendship. I don't know if you know that. At least according to the scriptures, it's not. God's friendship is determined by our obedience. John 15:14, Jesus puts a condition on his friendship, which means that he's not friends with people unless they meet the condition of his friendship. His love is unconditional. There's no doubt about that. His forgiveness is unconditional. But his friendship is conditional upon what he has said. And this is the only time he says that you are my friends. If. You're my friends if you do what I command you to do. That is a bold thing to say, Jesus. And it's not often what people are saying these days. People talk about, or they paint God in their own image, that he should be just like them or think just like them, but we must allow him to be who he says he is and not create Jesus in the desire of our hearts, of who we want him to be. It can be one of the biggest areas of danger for us as Christians is that we think God is who we want him to be, rather than who he says he is. And the thing is that Jesus is very comfortable in who he is. When he says things that people don't like, when he does things that people don't like, he doesn't try to stop them. He doesn't try to explain. He's just like, man, you can go, okay. Think of John chapter 6, where Jesus says, eat my flesh and drink my blood. Right? And all the people are like, whoa, hold on a second. Right? And these days, you would expect any like mega church pastor who would say something like that, and everybody's starting to get from their seats and leave the congregation. They're like, gosh, this guy's a whack job. You'd be like, wait. Let me explain. Slow down. That's not what I meant. And Jesus is kind of just like, see you later. And even so much that he like turns to his elders, his disciples, and he says, do you want to go also? You know, Jesus is not in the game of trying to get to people please. He's content in who he is. And if people don't like that, and they don't understand him, he's not going around trying to get people to understand all of who he is. This is who I am. You can take it or leave it. And sometimes when we preach the gospel or when we talk about Jesus, we kind of talk about him like a needy beggar. Let him into your heart. He needs a place to live. Jesus said, follow me, not let me come into you. Take up your cross. Right? All these images, right? And that's what we see with the children of Israel, is here they have to make tough calls, and they have challenging circumstances that they face. But they, in the book of Exodus at least, we see these 25 times they do exactly what God asks them to do. We see this demonstration of their actions. And that is still what God is looking for in those that say yes to following him. And so they go out in chapter 13, and we see the feast being recounted and the pillar of fire and cloud showing up to lead them. And so God, his presence is there to lead the people out of Egypt, out of slavery. But they get to chapter 14 in this very important chapter, the crossing of the Red Sea. Okay. So the people come to the Red Sea, and there's a number of reasons for this event, or a couple of things that are taught through it for the people. So some of the things that this teaches, or the purposes behind it, really the first one we see is to separate Egypt from Israel. Okay. What Moses will say to Israel is that from this day you will never see these Egyptians again. Okay, so there is a clear separation from their former oppressors through this dramatic event of deliverance. The second event, or second purpose, is to act as a witness, that this event would be a witness to the nations around them of God's power, of his deliverance, of his real supremacy over all of the other gods and over all areas of nature. And we see this, that when the spies go into the land of Canaan, 40 years later, that they go into Rahab's house, and she is talking about the parting of the Red Sea. 40 years later. We know who your God is. We know what he did at the sea. We know how he parted it and made a way for you guys to come. Right? And that is really what prompts her to come to the God of Israel, is his action. And so what you see is that 40 years later, the desire of God from Exodus chapter 9, verses 14 through 16, is being fulfilled in Rahab's life. That the nations would know him. They would see his great power and they would come to him. The third purpose really is to show Israel who their God is. This moment should be a convincing moment for them to understand who God is and how to respond to him, how they are to treat him, and how he has shown himself good to them. That he will deliver them. And this should honestly enforce their trust in him as they head towards the promised land. That when they get to the promised land, they know what God has done in the past. And so why should they be scared when they're facing anything ahead of them? Because of how dramatically God has delivered them from their enemies. That should enforce his future deliverance from any enemy. The first one is separation from Egypt and to not be part of them again, like a division from them. This story and the Exodus story will be one of the most common tools that the prophets will use to try to convince the people of God's faithfulness. They will constantly reference back to the Exodus story, to Mount Sinai, to the covenant, to the parting of the Red Sea, because this is one of the most dramatic and initial moments of God's faithfulness before they ever enter into a covenant with him. So before they get to Mount Sinai, before the covenant really begins, God is showing himself faithful. And this is one of the ways the prophets will say, God has demonstrated his goodness to you before you even were in a commitment with him. That's how much he loves you. So why have you turned away from him? Why have you walked away to other gods and to other nations when God has shown himself so good to you in the past? Now, as the people are here, they feel like they're going to be overcome. That the Egyptians are going to take over them. They're going to destroy them. They should have never left. And we see God's desire for his people, that he will fight on their behalf in this moment, that he is going to show up. And this is one of the first real trials that Israel will face, is their trust in God at the Red Sea, is to trust him for his deliverance when they don't see anything happening yet. And that it provokes for us the same kind of idea. When difficulties and trials come, what is going to be our response personally to the Lord? Will we respond in trust and faith, or will we respond in skepticism and doubt and fear of what God will do or won't do? But God promises to the people that he will set them free and that he will be the one who delivers them. And so he gives Moses these instructions to raise up his arms, and that through the night an east wind will blow, and it will blow the waters away and will reveal the dry ground, so that Israel might pass through with the water on each side of them, and they will come out onto the other side, at which point then the chariots of Pharaoh's army rush into the Red Sea. And they follow until they're bogged down. And it's at that point they cannot go any further, and the water rushes over them, and Moses stands on the other side and says to the people of Israel, the Egyptians you see today, you will never see them again. Right. The one point of note from the tour guide yesterday, he mentions that Pharaoh drowned in the Red Sea, and he says, no, he didn't, because we have the body of Ramses. There is nothing in the scriptures that say that Pharaoh went into the Red Sea. It's a common misconception, is that Pharaoh went in also, but it does not say that Pharaoh went in. It says his chariots and his horses went into the sea, but it does not say that he did. Okay. Now, this story draws incredible parallels then to the salvation story and connections with what Jesus does on the cross. Because we see Jesus giving his life at the Passover Feast, and that the salvation message is much more than just a death for sins and an atonement for sins, but who God wants his people to be. And so Jesus comes to the Passover festival to give his life. And so we see him showing himself powerful, showing himself to be God throughout his ministry, just like God had done with the 10 signs to the people of Egypt. And on that 10th sign, Jesus, like the Passover lamb, is slain on the cross to make a way for people to leave from Egypt, to leave from sin. And Jesus, as he is on the cross, has a hyssop branch raised up to his mouth to give him wine on the cross. So this red liquid on a hyssop branch, just like the touching of the lintel and the doorposts with blood. And him on the cross, at the point where it seems that there is no victory, right? The point of the greatest defeat, Israel at this place where how are we going to win? And Jesus spreading out his arms on the cross like Moses spreading out his arms, so that he might make a way for all people to pass through the Red Sea of his blood, so that sin might be washed away. And as they come out on the other side of the Red Sea, of Christ's blood having washed them, they look back to see the Egyptians today they never have to see again. And like Israel, God's people are meant to go to Mount Sinai to receive the covenant, right? That is no longer written on tablets of stone by Moses at Mount Sinai, but is written on the tablet of their heart, like Jeremiah says in chapter 31. And that we would be those representatives who go into the promised land. And then the New Testament authors talk about how we are exiles in a foreign land, like those in wilderness, waiting to go to the promised land of God's kingdom, which will come one day. And so Jesus' death on the cross and the implications for our lives from Passover is so much greater than just death for your sins. Jesus didn't just die for your sins, he died for your sins so that you could become a people who represent him on the earth. So you could be joined in with the story of the Exodus, so that we might be those who pass through the Red Sea as well and be delivered, so that we can walk in freedom to demonstrate his kingdom to the earth and help others to find the same thing. Preaching of the gospel does not end at a person's payment for their sins. That is just the beginning. It continues on with following Jesus and walking with him. In fact, the most commonly used metaphor for the Christian life in the New Testament is to walk. And that is what Jesus is expecting of his people. And that's what we see in the book of Exodus here, is that people follow God out of the Red Sea. So the picture of the Red Sea then is not just a picture of deliverance from Egypt, and it's not just a picture of deliverance or of deliverance from sin for us, but it is also a picture of new creation. Okay? When you think back to Genesis chapter 1, how does it start? It says there was water over the face of the earth, and the Spirit hovered over the waters, and land was brought out of the water. Okay? And all the vegetation, and then the people placed in the water, placed on the land that has come out of the water. In the story of Noah, the judgment upon the earth through water is the reversal of creation. That the waters from which the land had once come now overtake all of the land. And when Noah comes out of the ark on dry land, it is just like a new creation story. Right? The ark comes to rest on dry land. He steps out onto dry land as this water has come out of the land, came out of the water again. And so, just like that here, we see the pillar of fire that brings light into darkness. The waters being divided, and dry land coming out of the waters, just like Genesis days 1, 2, and 3. And so this story is meant to not just embody a deliverance from Egypt, but it's meant to embody a new creation that Israel is supposed to be. They're supposed to be people who walk in God's ways. And part of the tabernacle idea that's going to be created is one of a garden. And we'll see that comparison and how that fits in with God's desire for his people to dwell in his garden again. And so there are an incredible amount of parallels in the Pentateuch and in later books of what is happening here. But the people head out from the Red Sea, and they wind up at this spring, this bitter spring called Mara. And for the next few chapters, 15, 16, 17, and 18, we'll see God providing for his people food and water on multiple occasions. And while the people are grumbling against God, it doesn't seem that it is that big of an issue, right? God is still showing his grace and his faithfulness to the people despite the fact that they are grumbling against him, and partially because they have not yet entered a covenant with him. So they're not in this covenant with God yet. They're his chosen people, and they will step into that agreement once they reach Mount Sinai. But in chapter 15 is an important note for them. The first place that they visit, and the first place that God shows up, he gives them a promise in chapters 15, verse 25 and 26, where he says in 25b, "There the Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them, saying, if you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God, and do that which is right in his eyes, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer." Right? He promises to be with them. Right? He promises to meet them and protect them. And this is going to tie in again with Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26, part of the curses that will come later on in those books. But God promises to guard them if they walk in his ways. Now, God never has expected and does not expect perfection. It might seem that way by the instructions of God given to the people, but God has never expected perfection of any of his people, and he did not think that they would keep the law perfectly. That was not the point. The point was to be his representatives, and we'll see how this plays out in the Ten Commandments. But the reality is that God cannot resist a repentant heart. And that's his expectation for his people, always. Is not that they'd be perfect, but they would be repentant. And you'll see that playing out a lot as you go through these stories. The two maps here I have, one in a picture and then one expanded on the slides, shows kind of the most traditional route that Israel took on their leaving from Egypt and heading down to Mount Sinai, St. Catherine's Monastery. And the place where they crossed the Red Sea is widely disputed and unknown. The Hebrew is translated into English for us from the Greek, the Red Sea, but the Hebrew is very clearly the Sea of Reeds. And it is probably a large body of water that has since dried up. And we are not sure where it is. It's widely disputed what it is. But the point still being that it is treated as a historical event that is one of the essential basis for God's character throughout the entirety of the Old Testament scriptures. And for those who would doubt it or call it metaphorical would be to begin to question the various aspects of the character of God that are revealed through this event if God is deceiving his future generations through this event. Okay, so the one thing that we cannot take to be unhistorical is the crossing of the Red Sea because of how it's used throughout the rest of the Old Testament scriptures. Okay, it brings in various levels of doubt of God's character in other places because of how it's connected with him. Chapter 16 through 18, we see God's provision for his people, yet they continue to quickly doubt him, very quickly doubt him over his provision. Is he good? Is he going to look after them? And it begs the question for us about the provision of God, our trust in his provision, and we're going to see that more in the tabernacle portions of our conversation tomorrow. But what we are beginning to see with Israel is that God is teaching them faith. Okay? And this brings an important point for us for Israel, because God is not just looking for their belief in him, right? Belief in his existence, but he's looking for their faith in him, their trust in him. It's an important concept for us because we talk about faith and belief. And sometimes, we'll just share the gospel with people and ask the question, do you believe in Jesus? And that question is unnecessary because Jesus is not looking for people's belief. He exists no matter whether they believe in him or not. Jesus is looking for people to put their faith in him. Now, if what we mean by belief in is that you believe in who he says he is and what he expects of you, then that's perfect. But oftentimes when we talk about belief, we just talk about existence. Most people say, oh, I don't believe in God, i.e., I don't believe he exists. And so the belief often is associated with existence. And God doesn't care about people's belief, he cares about their faith, right? That being said, right, of course he cares if they believe he exists in the context of faith. But it doesn't make him any more real, and it doesn't change often their understanding of him if they do or don't believe but don't have faith. So the faith conversation is the big deal. So what is faith? What is faith? What is the faith that God is trying to build inside of his people? Well, faith, the simplest way of defining it is as trust. Right? The most simple definition is trust. Faith is trust that somebody says, or somebody will be who they say they will be. But the way that the Greek word faith is used outside of the Bible is oftentimes in the respect of loyalty and allegiance. And so God is looking for his people to be allied to him, to be loyal to him. Their faith in him means they trust who he says he is, and they are loyal to live in accordance with his ways. That's what faith is in the Bible. And that's the expectation of all of our faith as well, is that when we put our faith in Jesus, we give our loyalty to him and our trust to him and our allegiance to him. Now, when you guys think of loyalty, the word loyalty, what comes to your mind instantly? Might be a dog. Don't be afraid to say it. Most people say dog. And it's a perfect example of loyalty, of what it looks like to be loyal to somebody. Is this animal who does not leave their owner's side no matter what, who cares for them, who comes to them, who seeks them, who wants to serve their owner. You know, dogs, going to get the paper, going to get silverware for people from the kitchen. It is this incredible picture of loyalty. And that's what faith looks like. It is an immense trust in our God and our loyalty to him. And so that's what God is growing in the people through his provision, through his care, right? Cleansing of the water, providing quail, providing manna. He's building their trust in who he is and their faith in him. And so he meets them where they're at with these things. So when they have attitudes towards him in these chapters, God is still abundantly providing for them. And through this is an establishment of their identity, of who God is, right? Because they've been slaves their whole lives for multiple generations and centuries. And their perspective is thoroughly Egyptian. Their way they treat God is thoroughly Egyptian. And now they're having to learn that he is different than the Egyptian gods and how they relate with him differently. And so he's creating an identity inside of them of who he is and how they're to understand themselves. And this paints that picture from chapter 4 where God calls them his firstborn son. So he's providing for them like a child. He's looking after them like a child. And even in their groaning and complaining, God still meets them. And that should be the point for us throughout all of these passages, and including in the book of Numbers where people are groaning and complaining, is that no matter all the emotions in the story, God is still caring for his people and he's still meeting them. Even when Moses disobeys and strikes the rock in Numbers instead of speaking to it to call the water out, God still provides the water for them. So even in the midst of their disobedience, God's provision is still so clearly seen. And all of this ultimately is to help Israel to know him better. So they might put their full trust in him and their full faith in who he is. And so I think the incredible point that we have to pick up on is that God's desire has been to be known, to be in relationship with his people. Not that he can be completely known, like I said before, but that we would begin to know him and be in a relationship with him where we are discovering who he is. Right? God's desire from the very beginning has been to be in relationship. The type of covenant God is going to make with his people is a relational covenant. We'll look at what that means. But God's desire has always been to be in relationship and for his people to discover him and for them to allow themselves to be open and vulnerable before him. So in chapter 19, they arrive at Mount Sinai, and this is where those 11 months at Mount Sinai are going to really begin for the people. And they'll be there until the second year and the third month, after the dedication of the tabernacle and the first census, and they're going to leave in Numbers chapter 10. And when you get to passages like this, it can be very easy to just read so quickly past things. And one of the greatest principles we can learn in good Bible study is slowing down. Slowing down is very important. If we rush through everything, we will not get as much out of it. Not that you can go slow on all of your assignments. You still need to turn them in. But in general, going slower is going to yield the greater results. Okay. So, how do you think Moses would have felt? Exodus chapter 4, God had said to him, or Exodus chapter 3, sorry, he had said to him, when you get back here, you will know that it was me. Right? When you get back here, that's your confirmation that I was the one who called you. Right? And when he arrives, the last time he was here, he was by himself with some flocks. Right? Just a bunch of animals and Moses at a burning bush at Mount Sinai. And now he's back with an entire nation of people, herds of cattle, tons of provision from the Egyptians, and stories of God's faithfulness in meeting his people and delivering them from the power of the Egyptians. This is an immensely powerful moment for him. And I think for any one of us, looking at the fulfillment of God's word and the confirmation should speak volumes to us about God's faithfulness. You know, do we have to have a confirmation at every turn to be obedient to anything we hear God say? Or do we trust him based off of his goodness to prior generations and to the patriarchs of the past? So with the passage here, as they arrive at Mount Sinai and begin to experience God's presence at the mountain, what is God's heart for his people? What does he say to them? Someone read chapter 19, verses 4 through 6 for us. Great. Thank you. So we see God's desire from the very beginning of this nation is that they would be an entire nation of priests. Okay? That should be significant to us because that's what Peter will call us as believers, is a royal priesthood. Okay, that's the exact same thing as saying a kingdom of priests. All right, what does that mean? What does it mean to be a priest in this historical context? Because not everybody are priests. In fact, priests are usually just from a certain portion of society and from more often an aristocratic class in society. And then they are viewed as some of the highest ranking officials inside of any cultural group. Okay, so it's not just like anybody can be a priest. So the fact that in Numbers chapter 6, God allows provision for any single person to take a Nazirite vow and to serve at the tabernacle is absolutely countercultural to any nation around them. Right? But God's desire was not to do that initially. God's desire is that all of the people would be priests before him. Okay? So what is a priest's primary job? A priest's primary job is to be a representative. Okay? Now, that will change and vary depending on which god it's for and what that looks like, but the primary deal is to be a representative for all of the nations. So, when the priest comes before all of the congregation of Israel, they are a representative of God. They wear white, right? They stand in purity and holiness, and they represent God to the people. And then, when they go to God and they stand before Him, they represent all of the congregation of their people. Okay? They are the representatives, whether that's God before man or man before God. Okay? You might be sitting there like, okay, I don't care about priests. You should, because you're a priest. Every one of you is a priest. And so knowing kind of the biblical expectation of what that means is important for how you are to live your life as a believer. For example, when the veil is torn in the temple at Jesus' death, does it make a way for everybody to enter God's presence? No. The veil only separated the priests from God's presence. Only the priests could enter into the temple, and only the high priest could enter behind the veil. And so when our true high priest, Jesus Christ, tears the veil in the temple, only the priests can go in. Nobody else. Okay? We stand as ministers before God coming into His presence. This is, it's another important point just with the whole idea then as God's children being priests. Okay? All of the people around us that do not know Christ are not God's children. That might come as a shock to you. Okay? The New Testament will say that anybody who's not a child of God is a child of the devil. People who don't know God are made in His image, but they're not His children. To go to somebody and to preach the gospel and say, you are a child of God, is not true. To tell them that God wants them to become His child is absolutely true and way more powerful. Because our gospel is a gospel of adoption. That God chose us, He wanted us, He invited us to come and be part of His family. That's the gospel we preach. It's way more powerful than telling somebody you're a child of God when they have never met God in their life and they don't care. To say that God desires them and chose them and wants to treat them like a loving father would, not like their earthly father did, is way more powerful. The invitation into a new family. And so the whole idea of God choosing them to become priests, to be representatives, that they are being invited into a relationship to be representatives of God is so powerful. And so for all of us in this room, we are God's representatives on the earth. We're the priests who can pass through the curtain where all of the other people could not. Okay, so the priest's primary role then is to be a representative. That no matter where they go, no matter who they talk to, that everybody would know that they're a priest. It's not like, oh, you can just go home and put your duties behind you. No, you are a priest always and forever. You're born into the family of Aaron. Tough luck, you're a priest. You have no choice. So for us as believers then, the implications are, when you come to Christ, you don't have a choice. You're automatically a representative of Jesus to every single person you will ever meet in your life. And for some people, you might be the only person they ever meet who's a Christian. In fact, the average statistics are that if you took every Christian and they preached the gospel to one of their non-Christian friends, or to one of their non-Christian friends, that there are still 2 billion people on the earth, estimated, that do not know a single Christian. 2 billion people who have never met a single Christian in their life and would not be able to hear the gospel. Okay, so this idea then is, it is the responsibility of the priest to be an example of Christ wherever we go. And that some people we meet may never have another chance to meet somebody who is a representative of our Father in heaven. And so the question then is, what kind of example do we leave? Because God calls them, His treasured possession, right? The kingdom of priests. Now the sad thing is that Israel is going to reject God. After all that He's done for them, they're going to say, we don't want that. And this is one of the examples of historical narrative literature that's very important for us. And while historical narrative literature will leave things out and keep certain things in, really at the discretion of the editor in the writing, one of the important lessons we must know about all historical narrative writing is that historical narrative does not tell you what you should do. It tells you what happened. It doesn't tell you what could have happened or what should have happened. It tells you what did happen. And oftentimes, historical narrative does not want you to imitate what happens. It wants you to learn from what happens. And historical narrative authors expect that all of the readers of this historical narrative know the law of Moses. They know God's desire. They've seen his heart expressed to his people. And so when a reader is reading these stories and seeing the response of the people, they're supposed to say, oh, that's wrong. That should not have happened. That was the wrong response. That's the expectation of the author. Okay? So as we're reading it then, we should look at this and we're like, you should not act like Israel. Right? We should say, yes, absolutely. Whatever you want is what I want to do. Right? And it should be the joyful response of any believer's heart. And so God sets himself apart on this mountain. We'll finish chapter 19, then we'll take another break. Okay, so God sets himself apart on this mountain and calls it holy ground. Right, that Israel can't come up to this certain portion on the mountain, certain point on it. And in the ancient Near East, mountains are thought to be the dwelling place of the gods. This is very common in the ancient world. Think of Mount Olympus, where all the gods dwelled for the Greeks. Think of the Tower of Babel. In Genesis chapter 11, the Tower of Babel is a tower in the middle of the desert that replicates a mountain. What are they trying to do? They're trying to reach the gods. They're trying to build a tower to heaven. Right? Now, for us, that doesn't make a lot of sense because we know the atmosphere is like tens of thousands of feet in the air, right? But for them, they would think it's very close. So the idea then of God inviting the people up onto this mountain to show up at the mountain meets them in their cultural understanding of God. And so the fact that God starts on a mountain and then he's going to move down into the camp is phenomenal. Because the gods dwelled on the mountains, everybody sought them on the mountains, they came up to the mountain to seek God, and God is going to say, build me a tent so that I can dwell in your midst. Astounding. Absolutely astounding. So chapter 19, that's really what we see, God's desire for his people. Their beginning of rejection of him, and then we're going to get into chapter 20 here. So let's take a break, and then after the break, we'll see if there's any questions, and then we'll continue on. So let's take, let's see. We can do 10 minutes, start back at 12:30. See how far we get in that time. Before we continue, are there any questions? I know we didn't really leave a lot of room for that in the last session. Are there any questions or anything that we've talked about or didn't talk about that you had a question on? Between chapters, anything we've talked about today, from chapter 10 through chapter 19 so far. Go for it. Okay. All right. Then let's talk about chapter 20 then. And if you guys have questions, please just, raise your hand and we'll cover those. So chapter 20, we're going to begin to look at the law. And so it's helpful to review covenants and law and the context of Old Testament law so that we kind of have a good idea of what we're working with and what to expect. So, covenants. There are three primary types of covenants that we will see in the Old Testament. This is very important to know for you guys. So the first one is called a Parody Covenant. On the slides, Parity. It's not a party covenant, but it might as well be. You know? The Parody Covenant is a covenant made between two equal parties, where there are equal stipulations upon one another. A couple examples come from Genesis 21, Genesis 22, and Genesis 31. The example of example in here is the one with Abimelech and Abraham, where they both have covenant stipulations on each other. Or Jacob with Laban is a parody covenant. Usually a parody covenant would be sealed with some sort of meal of agreement with one another, or they would feast together. In fact, most covenants had this kind of scenario, except for the next one. The most common parody covenant that we have today would be marriage. Two equal parties committing over certain vows or statements of commitment to each other for a certain period of time, usually until death. So that's a parody covenant. The next one is a unilateral covenant, or it's sometimes called a promissory covenant. Okay? Unilateral or promissory. I prefer unilateral because it's more descriptive. Okay? A unilateral covenant is a one-sided covenant where one party will make a promise to another party. And all of the weight rests upon the initial party, the one making the promise, to fulfill that and to keep all of the conditions of it. Okay, this is different than a promise. Okay, just making a promise to somebody, like I'm going to buy you a candy bar, is not a promissory covenant. Okay, but putting some kind of consequence upon yourself, it does make it a promissory covenant, right? Or some kind of weight upon the individual to bring some fulfillment to this. Okay, so God will make promissory covenants in the book of Genesis where he's going to vow them according to his character. Okay, so he cannot not keep them because of who he is. Okay, so Genesis chapter 9, the rainbow in the sky is a promissory covenant to never flood the earth again. Just a little thought on that. The rainbow in the sky, anybody know why it's called a bow? Because it looks like an archer's bow, right? So shooting an arrow looks like a bow, but it's hung up. All my wrath has been spent. So the rainbow is thought to be an archer's bow that's been hung in the sky. And so it's a symbol that there's no more wrath to be spent in this way. Genesis chapter 12, where God gives promises to Abraham, there's also a promissory covenant. Yes? Those are promissory. Yeah, unilateral. Yeah, unilateral or promissory, the same thing. Sorry, I'm using the language, both language, but yeah, unilateral. Genesis 9, Genesis 12 are unilateral covenants. And Genesis 15, where God says that I will bring you into this land. It's another unilateral covenant. And then we've got our last one, a suzerainty covenant. Okay, it'll take some practice to say that, but a suzerainty covenant, which is on the slide here, S-U-Z-E-R-A-I-N-T-Y, is one of the most common covenants in the ancient Near East. Okay. It is incredibly prevalent throughout this region of the world where Israel lived, specifically from the Hittite Empire and the Assyrian Empire, who would make suzerainty treaties or suzerainty covenants with other nations. And this is where a more powerful party will impose a covenant upon a less powerful party, and the less powerful party has no choice but to agree with it. Okay, so it is a forced covenant. Usually how this would play out is that there would be a more powerful nation who would come to a less powerful nation, they would conquer them, and then they would enter into a covenant with them where they would say, you have to provide for us food, tribute of wealth, soldiers for our military, and in return, we will protect you. So if a nation comes up against you, we will be there to protect you. Okay. And if you do not fulfill these things, amongst other minor points, then we will come against you and destroy you. But if you do those things, then we will protect you. Okay. So that's usually how it would go. It was very domineering, and the way the Assyrians and the Hittites would usually impose this covenant was through great acts of power and devastation. And so those who would be on the receiving end of this type of covenant would have been basically demolished. And they have no choice but to agree, and there's nothing they could do to stand against it. So, this type of covenant is the covenant that God makes with Israel. The difference is that instead of being an evil dictator, God is a benevolent king. He's shown himself to care for, to love, to protect, and to provide for his people before he ever made the covenant. And God didn't show his judgment upon Israel. He showed his deliverance to Israel and then made the covenant with them. And so the basis for this covenant is the opposite of what we see in the ancient world. The ancient world, this type of covenant would be imposed through dominance. God imposed this covenant through mercy. He said, I have been nothing but faithful to you and good to you. I've loved you. I've shown you my love. I've shown you my goodness. And now we're entering into a covenant together. And the reason God enters into this covenant is so that the people will represent him. Right? That's the main point, is they will be his representatives. So, when God makes the covenant with Israel, he says, if you obey me, if you walk in my ways, if you follow what I've asked you to do, then you'll be blessed. You'll be abundantly blessed. But if you don't obey and you follow your own ways and you follow the ways of the nations, then you will suffer the consequences. And so we use these two terms in these covenants that are common both in Hittite and also in Assyrian covenants, blessings and curses. So Deuteronomy 28, Leviticus 26 are the record of the blessings and curses in the covenant for Israel. Now, when we use those terms, we use them in such a hyper-spiritual way, but they are very basic. And all it simply means is these are what you can expect for your obedience, are the blessings, the things that you will receive in benefit. So these are the beneficial consequences of the covenant. Okay? And the curses are simply the consequences of disobedience. It's not a spiritual curse on the person. It's not the way we would use it in kind of witchcraft today to talk about cursing an individual. It is the consequences of their disobedience are those things. Okay? So that's this language. It's not some supernatural thing, but it's very physical and it's very real. So that's what God expects of his people. Now, again, like I had said, God isn't expecting them to be perfect, right? But God is expecting them to be repentant. So they will return to him. In fact, God will be incredibly long-suffering with his people. He will endure and bear with their disobedience and their reckless, hard hearts to be stiff-necked and stubborn for centuries. Right? In fact, God will suffer with the people for roughly about 1,000 years before he will enact the covenant consequences upon the people. Where he could have done it right away. Given the type of covenant and the stipulations of the covenant, when Israel makes the golden calf, God could have just destroyed them. But he will bear with them for 1,000 years. The mercy of God and the grace of God in the Old Testament is so incredible. And I would say we see more clearly and more fully the grace and mercy of God demonstrated in the Old Testament than we do in the New Testament. Because of the longevity of the relationship. Right? The truth of the matter is, the longer you know somebody, the better you know them, hopefully. That if somebody wants to be known, the longer you know them, the better you know them. And that's God, right? And what we see through the Old Testament from roughly about the time of Abraham until the time of Malachi is about 1,700 years, give or take some centuries. And we see God's character, his relationship, his desire for the people. And we see his grace and mercy so abundant. And so he bears with the people as he gives them this covenant for their future. Okay. So the types of laws that we see in the covenant are a few. There's 3 categories that we can majorly group them into. Now, some of these are overlapping, and some laws fit into both, and some laws occasionally don't fit into any of these three, but that is more of a rarity. So the three categories do fit quite well for a majority of the law. The first one is that there are laws specifically for morals, or moral laws. And these are what are going to define the moral values for the people, and these generally deal with matters of ethics. So you shall not commit adultery is a moral law. The civil law is the next one. And the civil laws are basically teaching people how to live in society the way that God desires them to live. So Deuteronomy is full of these types of laws. You know, if you accidentally burn your neighbor's field, you need to pay them back. These type of laws. If you have an ox that gores people, there's certain consequences that follow along with that. These are the social laws for the people and the civil laws. Most civil laws deal with matters of justice. And the third one, which we mentioned a little bit, is ritual or ceremonial laws. And these are much of the book of Leviticus and a good portion of the book of Numbers. And these are laws generally regarding the worship of Yahweh, the festivals and the feasts, the sacrificial laws, laws concerning skin diseases like leprosy, or what they should or should not eat, things like that. Now, inside of the laws, there's two basic formats for how laws are going to be laid out. And these two basic formats are case laws. And case laws are where a case is presented and then the outcome is determined. Okay, so if you burn your neighbor's field, you need to pay them back. And these are often phrased in an if-then statement. So a case is presented, and then the outcome is determined. On the other side of that, there are laws that are called apodictic laws, or a more familiar term would be absolute laws. And absolute laws are things that must always be done, and there is no condition on them. You shall have no other gods before me is an absolute law where there is no other option. There's no case. This is what you do, whether you like it or not. This is your commitment in a covenant, is the absolute laws. So the law is not necessarily meant to be exhaustive. Okay? It's meant to be illustrative. So the law of Moses is not exhaustive, it is illustrative. And what that means is that these are not enough laws to run a nation. If anybody has ever studied any law at any level in society, what you will know is that 613 laws is absolutely nothing when it comes to legally organizing a nation. In any modern nation today, there are tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of laws at various levels, from property to traffic to social, all over the place. And so the laws of the ancient world are not meant to be exhaustive in resolving every single case. They are meant to be illustrative. And so oftentimes the laws will give the most extreme situation, which is meant to teach you how to react to the less extreme situations. Okay? So, having a law about not murdering is not just about not murdering, but it's about vengeful actions or angry responses to people. Right? It's meant to be illustrative for how we treat one another. So this is how it'll operate. We'll see kind of how that plays out in the next session, probably tomorrow morning. But let's look a little bit at the Ten Commandments. So this is often called the Decalogue. That just means 10 words. And the 10 words are variously explained through different traditions. So the Jewish tradition will number these differently than the Protestant tradition and the Orthodox tradition, but I'll follow the more familiar one that we would know, the Protestant tradition. All of these are apodictic laws. All 10 of them are things that are not case. They are all absolute and must be followed by the people. So we'll highlight a few of these as we go through, just to give some illustration for it. So the first one is to have no other gods. Or specifically, right, it says, you shall have no gods before me. Okay. Now, that means that there shall be no other gods. And nothing that rises above Yahweh. Now, this is not an allowance for having, permitting the worship of other deities, right? But he is the only one. It can also be translated besides. So this law, as the first law given to the people, flies in the face of every other ancient Near Eastern culture. There is no other culture that had one single God and denied the worship of other gods. And so God is already setting himself apart. Where you go into the land of Canaan, amongst the polytheistic culture of the Canaanites, where there are a pantheon of 70 different gods, who all are in various relationships with one another, where there is violence and sexual promiscuity, where sister and brother gods are coming together in relationship to produce new gods. And this is the type of environment that Israel is in the midst of. And so to have Yahweh at the very beginning saying, you shall have no other gods, would have been completely out there, like totally away from what anybody would have understood. And what this also tells the people is that Yahweh has no consort. Okay? Consort is like a concubine or mistress kind of god. Okay? So there is no female partner with Yahweh. He is alone. There is no other God to be worshipped alongside of him. And what this also means is that God has exclusive claim to the children of Israel. Okay, like we highlighted, I've read it a couple times from Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9, where it says that the sons of God were allotted the nations of the world. And so God's portion is his people Israel. And because they have been apportioned to God, they are his inheritance, then no other gods are permitted to have them, and they should not be going to any other gods. So this is exclusive claim for God in relationship with Israel to not be shared with anybody. And so the essence of this relationship can be defined in one simple word, and that is faithfulness. God has been faithful to them, and they are to be faithful to him. The idea have, or the word have, you shall have no other gods before me, conveys the idea of possession in a variety of different ways. And when it's linked to an animate object, like a person, it always implies personal relationship. And so the command in and of itself also implies a personal relationship between Yahweh and his people. The second command, to have no graven images or no carved images, is a command specifically against idolatry. And this is a command, again, unlike any other nation around them, in that God would not be depicted in any kind of defined, carved, painted form. That there was to be no image that embodied him. Now, this will end up leading the people of Israel to preserve the mystery of God in such a complete sense that they will not even paint paintings of people. They won't build mosaics of people. And all of their coinage will never have a single image of a person on it. Why? Because humanity is meant to bear the image of God, and if you reproduce a person's image, then you are making an image of God, and you're breaking the second commandment. That's why at the temple, when Jesus is asked about taxation, shall we give our taxes to Caesar? He says, go and find the coin, the Roman coin. And they did not permit Roman coins into the temple precinct because they had Caesar's image on it. So when Jesus goes to have them get the temple, or get the denarius, he is asking them to go out and find something that they would have thought was an abomination inside of the temple. Okay. The way that we know Jewish homes from Greek homes or Gentile homes in the ancient world is because Gentile homes have no problem painting pictures of slaves and parties, and their murals will often depict people, where the Jewish homes will really just depict nature. So they'll have mosaics, very intricate mosaics on their floor, and it's just nature. Animals, plants, nature scenes. And the temple coinage they would use at the time of Jesus was the Tyrian shekel, because it only had images on it of reeds. And so that's what they would use at the temple, was the shekel from Tyre. So this kind of idea carries a lot of weight with it, of depiction of images. And while every other ancient Near Eastern god was depicted in some kind of idol or image, Yahweh did not have any image depicting him in a physical, carved, reproduced form, and the only image that was meant to represent him was his people. And this puts a lot of weight on the people to be good representatives of him, because they're the ones who bear his image. One thing to highlight here near the end of this commandment that is pretty pointed and comes out in a number of different places is this idea of what seems to be generational curses. Okay, so chapter 20, verse 4, we'll start, and I'll read the whole commandment. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything in heaven above, or that's the earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers and the children to the third and fourth generation to those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. So the point of this statement here that can often be misconveyed is that of this idea that God is somehow punishing future generations because of the sins that their parents committed, even unknowingly to the future generation. But the instruction of God and the commandment given here, as well as spoken in Exodus chapter 34 and in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 5, is that of a metaphor of the vastness of God's blessing upon those who love him, but his punishment of those who hate him. And so in Ezekiel chapter 18, people are also asking the same question. In Ezekiel 18, they say, the fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. Okay. Have you guys ever eaten something really, really sour and it makes your jaw clench shut? You cannot open it. It's just so sour, your whole mouth feels like it's just closing on itself. Okay? That's what the teaching was, is the fathers are the ones who committed all of the wrongs. They ate all the sour grapes, and then all of their children are now suffering the consequences of it. Okay, so it's this idea of a generational curse upon the children. But again, the idea of curse and blessing are not the idea of some supernatural imposition upon a future generation, but about the consequences of the covenant. Okay, so this idea here isn't necessarily teaching the idea of generational curses, but is demonstrating a metaphor of how good God's love and kindness and mercy is in comparison to the consequences of sin that he will bring upon people. Okay? And that's what we see all throughout the scriptures, is that God's desire is not necessarily to judge people and destroy people. His desire is always to bless people. Right? And this example here, for example, if we take this for what it exactly says and we read it literally, and we take generations to roughly be about 40 years, which is what the way the Bible treats them, is one generation is about 40 years. Okay, so these 3 to 4 generations is going to be anywhere from 120 to 160 years by a literal standard. And so, by 160 years after a ancestor's sin, then the consequences of that action will no longer be imposed upon that generation of children. But most people leave out the blessing idea. It says to the 1000th generation. Okay, that is 40,000 years. For most people, that is about the time that people started to appear on the earth if you look at it from an evolutionary standpoint. If you look at it from a creation standpoint, then people were created by God as short earth much later than that. So the example is that basically longer than humanity has been around, that's how long God's blessings go, over and above his curses, for those who love him versus those who hate him. So what is bigger? What's better, his blessings or his curses? His blessings, his protection. The thought that somebody's sin could have greater consequence on their life than the blood of Christ is to diminish Christ's payment of sin on the cross. One of the clearest examples of this that I've heard in an illustrative manner is Heidi Baker. She, if you don't know who she is, she runs Iris Ministries in Mozambique, has been one of the most important evangelists in that nation. And as she has gone out to villages and preached the gospel to people who've never heard the gospel before, there's this story of her going to a village and coming to the village, and there were already Christians in the village. And as she comes to the village and begins to talk to people, she meets the witch doctor, who, like a priest in the ancient world, is one of the most important people in the village. And as she talks to him, she starts to hear the story of what had happened in the village. And basically what had happened is that there were people who were starting to come to faith. And the witch doctor, who had been historically the one that people would seek for answers from the gods or in some kind of spiritual power or capacity, would come to him with the intentions of bringing or speaking some kind of cursing or like sickness upon people, broken bones, all sorts of things. So what he would do is gather a large variety of ingredients, including some hair from the individual, put it into a basin, and light it on fire. And the smoke from all of the ingredients, he would call out the face of the individual by name. And as he called them out by name, the face would show up in the smoke. And he would be able to curse the individual with the formulas that he had been taught prior as a trainee in his area of witchcraft. And that person would suffer the consequences of his words within a week or two. Very well known, very common in the village. What began to happen as people got saved is he would call people's faces up in the smoke, and the face would not come. And he didn't know why. And so he began to go to these people over and over and over to say, why is this happening? What are you doing that's keeping you from calling me, or from me calling you up in the smoke? And they said, well, I've given my life to Christ. And what he had begun to realize is the power of the Holy Spirit to protect them from the curses that he was speaking over them was so much more powerful than what he had been doing to them. And so this idea that somehow in our world today, that Christ's blood is not powerful enough to overcome the curses or consequences of sin from a prior generation spiritually, is to diminish the work of Christ on the cross. To say that my parents' sin is more powerful than my salvation is an incredible statement to make, when Jesus never makes that statement, where no author in the New Testament alludes to the fact that some kind of work must be done in your spiritual life after you give your heart to Christ. To then say that we must find a way to purify ourselves more deeply than the work of Christ could have done at the moment of our salvation is an incredible statement. And so the instructions here are not as much to give a literal statement of how far back to go in our past to search for something that we might never find, but to look at the character of God and his goodness in contrast to his judgment. We see this well played out in a variety of different places. God's desire is always more to bless than it is to curse, to judge, right? His desire is more to give the benefit of his good character than it is to bring the judgment of his wrath upon people. How do we see that, and how do we know that? Well, Abraham, when he talks with God about Sodom and Gomorrah, he bargains with him, right? If there's 50 righteous people, will you destroy the city? If there's 10 righteous people, will you destroy the city? If there's 5 righteous people, will you destroy the city? And God says no, every time. When God tells Jeremiah to go search the city for a righteous person so that he might spare the city. What we learn about God is that his desire is much more to benefit the people, to bless the people, than it ever is to judge them. And the principle is true, is that God's judgment upon an individual and upon a person is not based upon the amount of wickedness, but the lack of righteousness. That's his statement all through the prophets, that it is not about the degree of wickedness, but the lack of righteousness in a city which is leading to its destruction. Because over and over, God asks, where are the righteous people? Where are the righteous people? He's not saying, look at how much wickedness there is. There's all these terrible people. He is asking, where are the faithful ones? Where are the righteous people? And that's what we see here. God's desire is much more for the righteous than it is to judge the wicked. Not that he won't do that, but we see his desire here. Okay. The third commandment is this one simply says, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. What does this mean? Does it just mean that we shouldn't say, oh my God? Maybe I just took the Lord's name in vain. I don't think so. The taking of the Lord's name in vain bears a number of examples where people will use the Lord's name in flippant oaths, where they will take very rash vows upon themselves and vow it to the Lord. Jephthah does this with his daughter. So this is a basic instruction not to use the Lord's name in a flippant way that is a disrespectful way towards him. The Jews take this so seriously throughout all of their history that they will not even pronounce the name of God so they don't accidentally take it in vain. That's why they don't call him Yahweh. They call him Adonai. Or when they're reading the scriptures, they will just be silent. Whenever it says the Lord's name, they will not speak the name. Or they will call it the name, Hashem. And they'll just refer to him as the name. But beyond that, the idea of taking something, the verbal form of take here, more often carries with it the idea of holding something or bearing something, to carry it as a burden. And so the idea is then not just what comes out of your mouth, but how you live your life. That taking the Lord's name in vain is more about the way you live in response to his commandments and his instructions than it is about the words that come out of your mouth. And so for believers, I think the question, this is a good question probably for us to end on today, is how are we carrying the Lord's name in our life? Are we somebody who is a believer by mouth or by action? Is the Lord's name carried by us in vain, that we look no different from the world around us? Or are we set apart? Do we live the way God has called us to live? Value the things he's valuing, and to actually carry his name the way he wants it to be carried in our lives? So that we would take it upon ourselves and be those who bear the Lord's name upon our lives like we would wear a backpack. So, it's a good time for us to break so we can pack up and be ready for lunch when it comes. So I'll pray, and then if there's any questions, we can take some questions. Lord, thank you so much for this time. We're so grateful, God, for your mercy upon us and your goodness to us, Jesus. How you have given yourself, how you've made a way for us to be your people. And just like with the children of Israel being freed from the Egyptians of the Exodus, God, you made a way for them to be set free, to become your nation. And Lord, we're so grateful that you've done the same thing for us, that we might step into the role and the call that you've given over our lives to be examples of you to this world, that we would be like your children in the wilderness, heading towards the promised land, God. And I pray, Jesus, that we would live as examples in our lives, Jesus, truly considering the way that we live for others, Lord, to demonstrate your kingdom, to be the priests you've called us to be those who take your name not in vain, Lord, but to be those who bear your name for the glory of the kingdom of God, for your name, Jesus. Lord, I pray you would bless this class as they study your word. God, would you open it up to them? Would you help them to know you better through it and to be revealed through this amazing book? In Jesus' name, amen. Hey, this is just a brief tacked on clip at the end of the Exodus third day video that I'm disappointed to have to say that in the middle of the lecture of the fourth day, the last day of lecture, covering chapters about 20 through 40, the tabernacle, the golden calf narratives, finishing out of the 10 commandments and talking about the covenant and the laws in chapters 20 through 24 was lost because of my computer overheating. As you see from the previous day's lectures, the sun is shining down in the late morning, and it seems that probably my computer overheated and froze and then restarted once it cooled down a little bit, and so I lost the video in the middle of the lecture. So I'm really sorry about that, and I hope that sometime soon that I can record the fourth day and be able to share that with you all. So I hope that you're able to get something from the first few days in chapters 1 through 20, as well as the background video. And thank you for watching.